They didn't just want the money, they wanted to see me break. When the lawyer handed me that battered box, my cousin laughed the sound of a predator standing over a carcass. But they forgot what my grandmother taught me: the most dangerous thing in the room isn't the loudest voice, but the one keeping score. They thought the box was trash. They didn't realize they had just handed me a loaded gun, and they would be the ones to pull the trigger. My name is Sharon Brookfield. I sat in the corner of the conference room at Sterling and Partners, a ghost in a gray cardigan, watching the relentless Seattle rain assault the floor-to-ceiling glass. We were 40 floors up, suspended in the gray slurry of the sky, detached from the grid of the streets below, but trapped in a different kind of cold. I arrived 30 minutes early. It was a habit my grandmother, Eleanor, had drilled into me, but it was also a strategic choice. I wanted to be part of the furniture by the time the vultures arrived. I wanted to see them walk in before they had time to compose their masks. The conference room was a cavern of mahogany and brushed steel, designed to make human beings feel small and insignificant in the face of the law. The table was long enough to land a small aircraft on, polished to a mirror shine that reflected the storm outside. I sat in a chair that cost more than my car, my hands folded in my lap, waiting. Precisely 5 minutes past the hour. The double doors swung open. They didn't knock. They didn't apologize for being late. They simply occupied the space, assuming the air in the room was there specifically for them to breathe. Uncle Richard led the phalanx. He was a large man who had allowed his muscle to turn to heavy, expensive suet. He wore a navy suit that strained slightly at the buttons, a testament to too many business dinners and too much scotch. His face was flushed, a permanent map of high blood pressure and suppressed rage. He walked with the heavy tread of a man who believed the ground should be grateful for his weight. Behind him came Aunt Margot. If Richard was a sledgehammer, Margot was a scalpel sharp, cold, and entirely artificial. Her face was a testament to the advancements of modern cosmetic surgery, pulled so tight that her expressions were mere suggestions rather than actual movements. She wore a black dress that was appropriate for mourning in color only. The cut was aggressive, designed to show off a figure she paid a trainer thousands of dollars a month to maintain. She smelled of chemical flowers and gin. Trailing them was Tiffany, my cousin. She was 24, 8 years my junior, and lived her entire life through the lens of a smartphone screen. She didn't look up as she entered. Her thumbs were a blur on the glass of her device, likely updating her followers on the tragic burden of inheritance. She wore oversized sunglasses indoors, pushed up into her bleached hair, and an outfit that looked like it had been curated by a stylist who hated her. They took their seats at the center of the table. Richard threw his leather portfolio down with a thud. Margot adjusted her chair, wiping an invisible speck of dust from the armrest with a grimace of distaste. Tiffany slumped, sighing loudly, as if sitting down was a supreme physical effort. Not one of them looked at me. Not one of them said hello. To them. I was just Sharon, the quiet failure, the data analyst who worked for a paycheck. The anomaly in the Brookfield genetic code. I was necessary for the legal quorum. Nothing more. It was a signature they needed to clear the way to the vault. "Where is Blackwood?" Richard barked, checking his gold watch. "I have a meeting at 2. "He will be here, Richard," Margot said, her voice a dry rasp. "Don't pop a vein before the check clears." "I just want this over with," Tiffany mumbled, finally looking up. Her eyes swept over me, and for a second, there was a flicker of recognition. But it was the way one recognizes a coat rack they had forgotten was in the hall. "Oh, hey, Sharon." "Hello, Tiffany," I said. My voice sounded flat in the acoustic perfection of the room. "You look tired," she said, managing to make the observation sound like an insult. "Is that the same sweater you wore last Christmas?" "Leave it, Tiff," Richard grunted. "She's here. That is all that matters." The door at the far end of the room opened, and Arthur Blackwood entered. He was the managing partner of the firm, a man who looked like he had been carved out of gray stone. He had served my grandmother for 40 years. He carried a single, thick file in a small, battered cardboard box. He did not smile. He did not offer condolences. He walked to the head of the table, placed the items down, and sat. The silence that followed was heavy, pressurized. "We are here to execute the last will and testament of Eleanor Vance," Blackwood said. His voice was a monotone drone, stripped of all emotion. It was the voice of a machine executing code. The deceased was of sound mind and body at the time of this drafting. The terms are absolute. Richard leaned forward, his knuckles whitening as he gripped the edge of the table. Margot sat perfectly still, like a cobra waiting to strike. Tiffany put her phone face down, the first sign of respect she had shown all day. Blackwood began to read. The legal jargon washed over us, a dry river of clauses and stipulations. I watched the rain hit the window. I felt a strange detachment, as if I were watching a play from the balcony. I knew they expected me to be anxious. I knew they thought I was hoping for a crumb. But I knew my grandmother better than they did. Eleanor Vance did not do handouts. She did tests. To my son, Richard Brookfield, Blackwood read. I leave my controlling shares in Brookfield Logistics and the entirety of my stock portfolio, currently valued at approximately $50 million. Richard let out a breath that sounded like a tire deflating. He slumped back in his chair, a smug grin spreading across his face. He looked at Margot and winked. $50 million. It was enough to cover his gambling debts 10 times over. It was enough to keep him feeling powerful for another decade. To my daughter-in-law, Margot Brookfield, Blackwood continued, not pausing for Richard's celebration. I leave the Vance estate in the Highlands, the vacation property in Aspen, and the penthouses in Miami and New York. The total estimated value of these real estate holdings is $30 million. Margot's eyes widened. She touched her throat, feigning shock. "Oh, Eleanor," she whispered, a performance for an audience of none. She knew how much I loved that house. She didn't love the house. She loved the address. She loved the parties she could throw there to impress people she hated. To my granddaughter, Tiffany Brookfield, Blackwood said. Tiffany sat up straighter. I leave my personal collection of vintage automobiles and my complete collection of jewelry, including the sapphire set commissioned in 1998. These assets are valued at roughly $12 million. Yes, Tiffany hissed, pumping a fist. I knew she wouldn't forget me. I told you, Dad. They were ecstatic. The air in the room lightened. The tension evaporated, replaced by the giddy intoxication of unearned wealth. They began to murmur among themselves, already spending the money in their heads, already planning renovations and vacations and acquisitions. I sat in my corner, my hands still folded. I was the only one left. Blackwood cleared his throat. It was a sharp, dry sound that cut through their celebration like a knife. He looked over the rim of his glasses, straight at me. And finally, he said. The room went quiet. Richard turned to look at me, his expression shifting from glee to a sort of patronizing amusement. Margot sipped her water. Her eyes narrowed. To my granddaughter, Sharon Brookfield, Blackwood read. He paused. He reached out and placed his hand on the small, battered cardboard box on the table. I leave the contents of the basement archive number 4 located at the Harbor District facility. Richard frowned. The old warehouse. That place is full of rotting paper and rusted filing cabinets. We were going to bulldoze it. Blackwood ignored him. He picked up the box and walked around the vast table toward me. The walk seemed to take an eternity. The carpet swallowed the sound of his footsteps. When he reached me, he held out the box. I took it. It was light. The cardboard was soft with age, the corners fraying. Inside, sliding around with a dull rattle, was a single object. I reached in and pulled it out. It was a USB drive, not a sleek, modern cloud key or an encrypted solid-state drive. It was a silver stick, thick and clunky, the plastic cap missing. The casing was scratched and worn, the silver paint chipping away to reveal the gray plastic underneath. On the side, written in fading black marker, was the capacity, 2 gigabytes. It was a piece of technology from 2 decades ago, a relic, Electronic debris that you would find in the bottom of a junk drawer, tangled in old charging cables. For a moment, there was absolute silence. Then, a sound cut through the air, a high, sharp bark of laughter. Tiffany was laughing. She covered her mouth, but the giggles spilled out. "Oh my God," she gasped. "Is that it? A flash drive? 2 gigabytes. You can't even fit a movie on that." Richard chuckled, a deep, rumbling sound. He shook his head, looking at me with eyes that held a toxic mixture of pity and contempt. "Well," he said, spreading his hands. "Mother always did have a unique sense of humor. I suppose she thought you could use it for work. Sharon, you like computers, don't you?" "It is fitting, really," Margot added, her voice dripping with faux sympathy. Eleanor knew Sharon lived a simpler life. She wouldn't want to burden you with assets you couldn't manage. "Dear, property taxes are a nightmare, you know." "She literally gave you trash," Tiffany said, wiping a tear of mirth from her eye. "That is savage. Grandma was savage." I held the drive in my palm. The metal was cold. It felt heavy, heavier than it should have been. I ran my thumb over the scratched casing. I didn't look at my family. I didn't let them see my face fall, because it didn't fall. Inside my chest, my heart was beating a slow, steady rhythm. I remembered the last time I saw my grandmother alive. She was in her hospital bed, hooked up to machines that beeped and hissed. But her eyes were clear. They were gray, like the Puget Sound in winter. She had grabbed my wrist with a grip that was surprisingly strong. "Don't look at the gold. Sharon," she had whispered, "the gold is for the fools who want to shine. You look for the information. Data is the new oil. Sharon, never forget that." I closed my hand around the drive. It was warm now, absorbing my body heat. "Is that all?" Richard asked, standing up and buttoning his jacket. "We have celebrations to attend to, champagne to pop." "That is the entirety of the will," Blackwood said, returning to his seat. He closed the file. "Well, Sharon," Richard said, walking past me. He clapped a heavy hand on my shoulder, a gesture that felt more like a shove. "Don't spend it all in one place. If you need help moving that box of papers out of the basement, call my assistant. I am sure we can spare a janitor to help you." "Bye, Sharon," Tiffany sang, following her father. "Good luck with whatever that is." Margot didn't say anything. She just gave me a thin, tight smile that didn't reach her eyes, and swept out of the room in a cloud of perfume. I sat there for a moment longer. The room was quiet again, save for the rain. I looked down at the drive in my hand. They saw a piece of plastic. They saw an insult. They saw a grandmother dismissing the granddaughter she didn't love. I saw a puzzle, and I knew my grandmother. She didn't make mistakes. She didn't do random acts of cruelty. Everything she did was calculated to the 4th decimal point. I stood up, sliding the drive into the pocket of my jeans. I picked up the empty cardboard box. It felt like I was carrying nothing, but I knew I was carrying everything. As I walked toward the door, I glanced back at the head of the table. Arthur Blackwood was still sitting there. He wasn't packing up. He wasn't checking his phone. He was watching me. His face was still a mask of stone, but his eyes were different. The professional detachment had slipped, just a fraction. He wasn't looking at me with the pity Richard had shown. He wasn't looking at me with the mockery Tiffany had displayed. He was looking at me with expectation. He was waiting for me to understand. I nodded to him, a single sharp dip of my chin. He didn't nod back, but I saw the slightest twitch at the corner of his mouth. I walked out of the glass tower and into the rain. The water was freezing, soaking through my thin cardigan in seconds. But I didn't feel the cold. I felt the weight of the drive in my pocket, thrumming against my hip like a second heartbeat. They thought they had won the lottery. They didn't know the game had just started. The rain had followed me home. It lashed against the single window of my studio apartment in the Capitol Hill district, a rhythmic drumming that usually helped me sleep. Today, it sounded static. My apartment was nothing like the glass tower I had just left. It was 400 square feet of efficiency, filled with the hum of servers and the scent of stale coffee. It was small, but it was mine. It was the one place in Seattle where I did not have to apologize for existing. I locked the door and slid the deadbolt home. I did not cry. I had expected the tears to come during the drive back, or perhaps in the elevator, but my eyes remained dry. Crying implies surprise, or betrayal, or a grief that is fresh. I felt none of those things. The humiliation I had just endured in that boardroom was not a new wound. It was just another layer of callus on skin that had toughened over 30 years. Richard, Margot, and Tiffany had not done anything unpredictable. They had simply played their parts in a script written long ago. I took off my wet cardigan and hung it by the door. I walked to my desk, the command center of my life. It was a chaotic contrast to the rest of my neat apartment, dominated by 3 monitors and a custom-built rig that I had assembled myself. This was where I worked, where I lived, and where I hid. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the USB drive. In the harsh light of my desk lamp, it looked even more pathetic. The silver paint was flaking off, revealing the cheap gray plastic underneath. The cap was missing, exposing the metal connector to dust and lint. 2 gigabytes. It was an insult mathematically designed to be precise. It was small enough to be useless for modern media, but just large enough to hold a lifetime of digital clutter. I sat down and woke up my primary machine. I did not plug the drive in immediately. That was the first rule of data hygiene I had learned at Vanguard Data Systems. You never trust a foreign device, even if it comes from your dead grandmother. Especially if it comes from your dead grandmother. Eleanor Vance was many things, but she was not careless. If she gave me this drive, she intended for me to do something with it. I booted up a sandboxed environment, a virtual machine completely isolated from my main network and the internet. It was a digital quarantine zone. Only then did I insert the drive. The computer chimed. A window popped up. My heart sank. The drive was a mess. It was filled with hundreds of folders with nonsensical names like Recipes 2004 and Garden Plans and Miscellaneous. I opened the first folder. It contained blurry, low-resolution photos of flower arrangements, seemingly taken with a first-generation camera phone. The next folder held corrupted PDF files of knitting patterns. Another was full of text files that appeared to be grocery lists from 15 years ago. Milk, eggs, bread, cat food. It looked exactly like what Tiffany had said it was. Electronic garbage. The digital detritus of an old woman who did not understand how to delete things. I leaned back in my chair, the springs creaking. Was this it? Was this the final lesson? Was Eleanor trying to teach me that sometimes there is no secret meaning? That sometimes you just get left with the trash? I reached out to eject the drive, but my hand stopped. Something was wrong. I worked as a senior data analyst at Vanguard. My job was to find patterns in chaos, to look at millions of lines of server logs and find the single anomaly that indicated a security breach or a system failure. My brain was wired to notice things that did not fit. And something about these files did not fit. I looked at the file list again. I switched the view from icons to details. I looked at the file sizes. The first file, a photo of a rose, was exactly 8 kilobytes. The second file, a text document, was 13 kilobytes. The third, a corrupted PDF, was 21 kilobytes. The fourth was 34 kilobytes. My breath hitched. 8, 13, 21, 34. I scrolled down. 55, 89, 144. It was the Fibonacci sequence. Each number was the sum of the 2 preceding ones. Nature's golden ratio. My grandmother loved roses, not because they were beautiful, but because their petals spiraled in perfect mathematical precision. This was not garbage. This was an index. I sat forward, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. The lethargy vanished, replaced by the cold, sharp focus of the hunt. Eleanor had not given me a box of random files. She had given me a haystack, and she had arranged the hay to point directly at the needle. I opened a terminal window. I needed to see what was underneath the image of the rose. I ran a hex dump on the first file. The screen filled with columns of hexadecimal code. pairs of numbers and letters that represented the raw data of the file. To the untrained eye, it was gibberish. To me, it was a language. I scanned the header. It claimed to be a JPEG image, but the header data was wrong. The signature bytes were manipulated. I wrote a quick script in Python to iterate through every file on the drive. I told the script to ignore the file names and the extensions. I told it to look only at the file sizes that matched the Fibonacci sequence and to extract the last 2 bytes of data from each of those specific files. It took the computer less than 10 seconds to process the thousands of dummy files. The script finished. It spit out a string of characters on my black screen. It was not a sentence. It was not a letter. It was a block of alphanumeric text, 64 characters long, starting with 0x. It was a private cryptographic key. I stared at it, my pulse thumping in my ears. A private key of this complexity was not used for locking a diary. It was used for securing digital wallets or accessing high-level encrypted servers. But a key is useless without a lock. Where was the door? I went back to the file structure. I had used the file sizes to find the key. What about the folder names, recipes, garden, miscellaneous? They seemed random. I sorted them by date modified. The dates were all identical, except for 4 folders. 1, 9, 2, 1, 6, 8, 0, 1, 192, 168, 0, 1, 192.168.0.1. It was a local IP address format, but that was too simple. That was a default gateway for a home router. Eleanor would never use something that generic. I looked closer at the timestamps of those 4 folders. They were not just dates. They were times. The seconds did not match standard timekeeping. They went beyond 60. I converted the timestamps into coordinates. No, that led to the middle of the Pacific Ocean. I converted them into hex. Nothing. I closed my eyes and visualized my grandmother. I thought about her office, her library. I thought about the way she played chess. She never attacked from the front. She always used the board itself against you. Data is the new oil. Oil flows through pipelines. Pipelines connect points. I looked at the raw data of the drive's partition table. Most people think a 2 gigabyte drive has 2 gigabytes of space, but there is always a tiny sliver of space reserved for the system, usually a few megabytes at the start of the drive to tell the computer how to read it. I used a disk editor to look at the master boot record. There, hidden in the sector usually reserved for error correction, was a single line of code. It was a hard-coded instruction pointing to a static IP address. It was an external address, a gateway. I copied the IP address. I copied the private key I had extracted. I took a deep breath. I was about to leave the safety of my sandbox. If this was a trap, if this was some malicious software designed to wipe my computer, I was about to expose my main system, but I had to know. I opened a secure browser on my main rig. I routed my connection through 3 different proxy servers, bouncing my signal from Singapore to Iceland to Toronto, just to be safe. I typed in the IP address. The screen went black. For a long moment, there was nothing. No loading bar, no error message, just the void. Then, a single cursor began to blink in the center of the screen. Enter private key. I typed in the 64-character string I had harvested from the Fibonacci files. Authenticating. The text was green, the font distinctively retro. It looked like a terminal from the late 90s. Access granted. Welcome. User 01. The black screen dissolved. A video player appeared. There was no buffering. The resolution was crystal clear, far too high for the era the interface mimicked. And there she was. Eleanor Vance sat in her high-backed leather chair in her library. But this was not the Eleanor of the last few years. This was not the frail woman with the oxygen tube and the shaking hands. This was the Iron Lady. She was wearing her signature charcoal suit. Her hair was perfectly coiffed. Her eyes were sharp, intelligent, and terrifyingly direct. She was looking straight into the camera lens, which meant she was looking straight at me. "Hello, Sharon," she said. Her voice filled my small apartment. It was strong. devoid of the wheeze that had plagued her final days. I felt a shiver run down my spine. It was like seeing a ghost, but a ghost that had more life than the living people I had left in that boardroom. If you are watching this, the video Eleanor continued, folding her hands on her desk, then you have passed the test. You ignored the insult of the packaging. You looked past the chaos of the data. You applied your logic, your patience, and your skill. She leaned forward slightly. I knew you would. You were always the only one who actually listened. I found myself nodding, responding to a recording. Richard, Margot, Tiffany. She said their names with a tone of mild distaste, as if discussing a pest infestation. They see wealth as a number in a bank account. They see it as something to be spent, displayed, and consumed. They are children playing with matches. If I had given them what I am about to give you, they would have burned the legacy to the ground in a decade. She paused, allowing the weight of her words to settle. The $80 million I left them, the houses, the cars, that is the decoy. Sharon, that is the cheese in the mousetrap. It is enough to keep them busy. It is enough to make them feel like winners. It is enough to make them stop looking. My heart began to hammer against my ribs. $80 million was a decoy. For the last 20 years, Eleanor said, her eyes gleaming, I have been building something else. While Richard was playing golf and Margot was hosting galas, I was investing in the infrastructure of the future. I bought patents for technologies that did not exist yet. I bought server farms in cold climates. And at 2009, when everyone else laughed at digital currency, I bought it. I bought it heavily. She tapped the desk. I call it the Shadow Fund. It is a decentralized portfolio of assets that do not appear on any public ledger. It is hidden behind shell corporations, encrypted servers, and layers of legal misdirection that even the IRS has not been able to penetrate. She took a breath. As of the recording of this video, 3 months prior to my death, the valuation of the Shadow Fund is $1.2 billion. I stopped breathing. The number hung in the air. 1.2 billion. But money is dangerous, Sharon, she said, her voice dropping to a serious, almost warning tone. Money like this attracts predators. It attracts governments. It attracts enemies you do not know you have. That is why I could not leave it to you in a will. A will is a public document. If I had written this down on paper, Richard would have tied you up in court for the rest of your life, or worse. She sat back. The private key you found grants you view-only access to the ledger. You can see it, you can verify it, but you cannot touch it, not from there. On the screen, a map appeared, replacing her face for a moment. It showed a satellite view of the industrial district down by the Seattle docks. A red dot pulsed on a nondescript gray building. To take control, Eleanor's voice narrated, you must go to the physical source, basement archive number 4. The key is digital, Sharon, but the lock is physical. There is a man there named Silas. He is the only person on this earth besides me who knows the truth. He is waiting for you. The video cut back to her face. She looked tired now, the mask slipping just a fraction, revealing the grandmother who loved me. Do not trust anyone, Sharon, not your father's brother, not his wife, and certainly not that vacuous cousin of yours. They will smile at you while they pick your pockets, but you have the one thing they lack. She tapped her temple. You have the mind. Now, go get what is yours. The screen went black. I sat in the silence of my apartment, the hum of the computer fan sounding like a jet engine. $1.2 billion. I looked out the window. The rain was still falling, blurring the lights of the city. Somewhere out there, Richard was probably popping a bottle of Dom Perignon, toasting to his 50 million, thinking he was the king of Seattle. He thought he had won. He thought I was sitting in this apartment crying over a box of trash. I looked at the black screen. I looked at the USB drive. A cold calm settled over me. It was the same feeling I got when I finally cracked a complex code, the moment the chaotic data aligned into a perfect picture. I stood up. I went to the closet and pulled out my heavy waterproof coat. I did not need to sleep. I did not need to process. The time for emotion had passed. I grabbed the USB drive and shoved it deep into my internal pocket, next to my heart. The game was not about inheritance anymore. It was about survival. And for the first time in my life, I was the one holding the controller. The GPS on my dashboard was the only source of light in the car, casting a sickly blue glow over my hands as they gripped the steering wheel. I was heading south, away from the glittering high-rises of downtown Seattle, away from the sanitized wealth of Sterling and Partners, and into the industrial scar tissue of the city. The harbor district was a graveyard of industry, a maze of shipping containers, rusted cranes that looked like the skeletons of prehistoric beasts, and warehouses that had been abandoned when the tech boom shifted the city's center of gravity. My grandmother's will had specified Basement Archive Number 4. The address led to a dead end near the water, where the smell of salt and diesel was thick enough to taste. The building was a brick monolith, its windows boarded up with plywood that had rotted black from years of rain. A faded sign hung crookedly above the loading dock, Vance Logistics. Someone had spray-painted closed across it in angry red letters. It was the perfect camouflage. To the outside world, this was just another failed venture, a tax write-off waiting for a bulldozer. To anyone watching, I was just a woman lost in the wrong part of town. I parked my car in the shadow of a dumpster. The rain here fell harder, unimpeded by skyscrapers. I pulled my coat collar up and stepped out. The silence was absolute, broken only by the distant groan of a foghorn. I walked toward the side entrance, a heavy steel door that looked like it hadn't been opened since the 90s. There was no handle, only a rusted keyhole that looked fused shut. I didn't reach for a key. I remembered the video. The lock is physical, but the key is digital. I pressed my hand against a patch of brick to the right of the door. To the naked eye, it was just masonry, but under my palm, I felt a faint vibration. A panel slid back with a whisper of hydraulics, revealing a sleek black glass interface. It was a biometric scanner, the kind used at high-security data centers, totally out of place on this rotting wall. I leaned in. A beam of red light scanned my iris. Identity confirmed. A synthesized voice whispered. It did not sound robotic. It sounded like Arthur Blackwood. The heavy steel door didn't creak. It didn't groan. It popped open with the smooth, oiled precision of a bank vault. I stepped inside, and the door sealed behind me, cutting off the sound of the rain instantly. I was standing in an airlock. The air was scrubbed clean, smelling of ozone and disinfectant. A second door stood before me, and standing in front of it was a man. He was sitting on a metal stool, reading a paperback novel with a cracked spine. He looked to be in his late 60s, with hair the color of steel wool and a face that looked like a topographical map of bad decisions. He wore a gray maintenance uniform that was perfectly pressed. A sidearm was holstered under his left arm, not hidden, but resting there with the casual familiarity of a wallet. He closed his book and looked at me. His eyes were pale blue, devoid of warmth but sharp with intelligence. "You're late, Miss Brookfield," he said. His voice was gravel. "Eleanor said you would be punctual." "Traffic," I lied. "And it is Ms. Vance. I am changing it." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. It vanished as quickly as it appeared. "Silas," he said, extending a hand that felt like sandpaper. "I ran security for your grandmother for 30 years. Before that, I did work for the government that does not exist on paper. Welcome to the engine room." "Take me to the archive, Silas," I said. He nodded and turned to the second door. He typed a code into a keypad, 14 digits. I noted, and the door hissed open. I had expected a basement. I had expected dust, cobwebs, and stacks of cardboard boxes like the one I had received at the law firm. I had expected the archive of a hoarder. What I walked into was a fortress. The space was cavernous, stretching out into the darkness. The floor was polished concrete. The temperature was kept at a frigid 60 degrees. And filling the space, row upon row, were server racks, towers of black metal and blinking blue lights, humming with a collective vibration that I could feel in the soles of my shoes. This wasn't just a server room, it was a data center that rivaled the ones at Vanguard. "This is the Shadow Fund," I asked, my voice echoing in the vast space. "Part of it," Silas said, walking ahead of me. "These servers host the decentralized nodes for the cryptocurrency wallets. They also house the proprietary algorithms that manage the trading. It is a closed loop, no external connection unless authorized by the key." He pointed to a glass-walled office in the center of the room, suspended slightly above the server floor like a captain's bridge. She spent her last days up there, watching the numbers. We climbed the metal stairs to the office. Inside, it was surprisingly analog. There was a simple wooden desk, a leather chair, and a wall of metal filing cabinets. No computers, just a single terminal that was powered down. Silas walked to the filing cabinets. "Your grandmother was a futurist, Sharon, but she was also a realist. She knew that digital walls can be breached. She knew that codes can be cracked. So she kept the most dangerous things on paper." He pulled out a thick ledger and placed it on the desk. Then he pulled out a stack of legal documents. "Sit," he commanded. I sat in my grandmother's chair. It felt too big for me. But as I settled in, I felt the vantage point she must have had, from here. She could see the blinking lights of her empire. "The $1.2 billion is real," Silas said, standing at parade rest by the door. "But money is just potential energy. It doesn't do anything until you move it. Richard and Margot think they have won the lottery. They have $50 million in stock and $30 million in real estate." He looked at me with a grim expression. "Eleanor ran the simulations, based on their spending habits, their gambling debts, and the leverage they will inevitably take on to maintain their image. They will be insolvent in 5 years, maybe 4. "She knew they would blow it," I said. "She counted on it," Silas corrected. "But she didn't want the family legacy to be sold off to strangers when they inevitably crash. She wanted the assets to return to the source." He tapped the legal documents on the desk. "These are transfer deeds for the holding companies that sit above the companies Richard and Margot think they own. You see, Eleanor didn't give Richard the company. She gave him the shares in the company, but the voting rights, the controlling interest that is held by a shell corporation called Aegis Holdings." He pointed to the signature line. "You are the sole director of Aegis Holdings. You control the board. You control the dividends. You control the liquidity events. Richard can play CEO all he wants, but you are the one who decides if the lights stay on." I looked at the papers. The legal structure was brilliant. It was a cage made of gold. Richard and Margot were trapped inside, thinking they were kings. While I held the key to the gate, I was the valve. I could starve them, or I could feed them just enough to keep them dependent. I picked up the pen. It was a heavy fountain pen, the same one Eleanor used to sign my birthday cards. My hand did not shake. I signed my name, Sharon Vance. "Done?" I said, capping the pen. "Not yet," Silas said. He walked back to the filing cabinet and unlocked a separate drawer. It was marked with a strip of red tape. He pulled out a black accordion folder. It looked old, stuffed to bursting with papers. He placed it on the desk with a heavy thud. "The money is the sword," Silas said softly. "This is the shield." I opened the folder. The first photograph made my stomach turn. It was Uncle Richard, looking younger, shaking hands with a man I recognized from the news, a contractor who had been indicted for racketeering 5 years ago. I flipped through the pages. Bank statements from the Cayman Islands. Emails printed out with timestamps. "Richard has been laundering money for the construction unions for a decade," Silas explained, his voice devoid of judgment. "He thinks he is clever. He moves it through the logistics company's fuel accounts. Eleanor let him do it because it kept him busy, and it gave her leverage." I turned the page. "Aunt Margot." "Bribery," Silas said. "Zoning permits for her real estate developments. She has a dedicated line item in her budget for consulting fees that go directly into the pockets of city council members. We have the wire transfers." "And Tiffany?" I asked. "Tax fraud on a massive scale," Silas said. "She claims her lifestyle is a business expense. She writes off her vacations, her clothes, her parties, But that is minor compared to the fact that she has been unknowingly mulling drugs for her boyfriend whenever she flies private. We have the flight logs and the cargo manifest. I stared at the pile of paper. It wasn't just dirt. It was nuclear waste. If this got out, they wouldn't just be poor. They would be in federal prison for 20 years. Why didn't she stop them? I whispered. She knew all this. She was stopping them, Silas said. By keeping this file, she ensured they never crossed the line from corrupt to dangerous. She kept them on a leash. Now, you hold the leash. This isn't for blackmail, I said, remembering the video. No, Silas agreed. Blackmail is messy. This is insurance. Eleanor knew that when they realized they couldn't access the real money, they would come for you. They will try to sue you. They will try to destroy your reputation. They will try to declare you mentally incompetent. This file is the only thing that will stop them dead in their tracks. I closed the folder. I felt a strange sensation in my chest. It wasn't a triumph. It was the heavy, cold responsibility of being the executioner. They were my family, by blood if nothing else, and I was holding the evidence that could end their lives. Suddenly, a siren cut through the air. It wasn't a loud, wailing alarm. It was a low, throbbing pulse of sound, accompanied by the room plunging into red light. The white overheads cut out, replaced by rotating emergency beacons. Silas spun around, his hand instinctively going to his holster. He looked at a monitor on the wall that had flickered to life. "What is that?" I asked, standing up. "External breach attempt," Silas snapped. He moved to the keyboard, his fingers flying across the keys. "Someone is pinging the perimeter of the Shadow Fund's firewall. They are using a brute force algorithm. It is clumsy, loud, and aggressive." "Who?" Silas brought up a trace window. Lines of code cascaded down the screen. "The IP is masked," he said, narrowing his eyes. "But the routing signature is distinctive. It is coming from a private server cluster in downtown Seattle, specifically from the terrifyingly expensive offices of a law firm." "Vince," I said. The name tasted like bile. Vince was Richard's personal lawyer, a man who made a living finding loopholes and breaking kneecaps legally. "They didn't wait long," Silas said. "They must have tried to access the offshore accounts Richard thought he inherited, found them frozen, and realized someone else had admin rights." "They know," I said. "They suspect," Silas corrected. "They are knocking on the door to see who answers. If we do nothing, they will eventually find a crack. If we push back, they will trace the signal to you." "Can we lock them out?" "I can sever the connection," Silas said, looking at me. "But that is a declaration of war. Once I drop the portcullis, they will know for a fact that the enemy is active and hostile." I looked at the red light pulsing on the faces of the servers. I looked at the black folder on the desk. I looked at the pen I had just used to sign my name. Richard and his team were probably sitting in a conference room right now, laughing, thinking they were just dealing with a glitch. They thought they were hunting a rabbit. "Do it," I said. "Cut the line." Silas didn't hesitate. He hit a single key. The screen flashed green for a second. Connection terminated. The alarm stopped, the red lights faded, and the white hum of the room returned. But the silence felt different now. It wasn't the silence of a tomb anymore. It was the silence of a trench before the whistle blew. "They will be coming for you, Sharon," Silas said quietly. "Let them come," I said, picking up the black folder. "I have the receipts." I walked down the metal stairs, the file tucked under my arm. The cold air of the server room felt bracing now. I wasn't just an analyst anymore. I wasn't just a granddaughter. I was the CEO of a ghost corporation, and I had work to do. The rain had stopped, but the air in Seattle remained thick, heavy with the threat of a storm that refused to break. I was back in my apartment, but my mind was elsewhere, specifically inside the sprawling, tastelessly opulent living room of my Uncle Richard's estate in Medina. I didn't need to be there physically to know exactly what was happening. I knew the players, I knew the stakes, and thanks to the unauthorized access alert Silas had shown me, I knew the exact moment panic set in. But to understand the trap I was setting, I had to understand the rats running into it. I imagined the scene with crystal clarity. Richard would be pacing. He always paced when he was losing, his heavy footsteps thudding against the imported Italian marble. He would be holding a tumbler of scotch, not sipping it, but clutching it like a weapon. "What do you mean, access denied?" Richard would be shouting, his face turning that dangerous shade of plum. "I am her son. I am the heir, fix it. Vince." Vince, his personal attorney, was a man who looked like he had been greased rather than born. He would be sitting on the velvet sofa, sweating through his cheap suit, typing furiously on a laptop that was currently telling him he was powerless. "It is not a glitch, Richard," Vince would say, his voice thin and reedy. "The accounts are there. I can see the balances, but every time I try to initiate a transfer, the system locks me out. It says insufficient privileges. Someone else has admin rights." "Who?" Richard would roar, hurling his glass into the fireplace. "Who has rights higher than me, Blackwood? Did that old fossil lock me out?" "Blackwood is just the executor," Vince would reply, wiping his forehead. "This is technical. This is systematic. It is like the money is in a glass box. We can look, but we can't touch." They would be spiraling. They had already spent the money in their heads. Richard had probably promised payment to his loan sharks by Friday. Margot had likely already put a deposit down on a new summer home. The realization that the tap was dry wouldn't just be annoying, it would be terrifying. And then, Tiffany would chime in. She would be draped over an armchair, scrolling through Instagram, bored by her father's meltdown until the conversation touched on her inheritance. "Wait," she would say, looking up, her eyes narrowing. "You know who acted weird at the reading, Sharon?" "Sharon." Richard would scoff. "The mouse, please. She got a box of trash." "Yeah, but she was weird about it," Tiffany would insist. "She kept touching that ugly little USB drive, like it was precious or something. And Grandma was all about data and codes at the end, right? What if the password is on that drive?" The room would go silent. Richard would stop pacing. The gears in his slow, greedy mind would finally catch. "The drive," he would whisper. "The 2-gigabyte drive. If the old lady put the keys to the kingdom on a flash drive and gave it to the one person we all ignored," Vince would trail off, realizing the magnitude of the oversight. "Get it," Richard would command, his voice dropping to a low, menacing growl. "I don't care how. Hire a PI. Hire hackers. I want that drive." Back in my apartment, the reality of their desperation began to manifest in my digital life. It started subtly. I was at work at Vanguard Data Systems, staring at a stream of server logs, when a notification popped up in the corner of my screen. "Failed login attempt S. Brookfield at Vanguard. Sys. Source. Vive PN Russia." I frowned. It was a standard brute force attempt, the kind our firewall deflected 1,000 times a day. But then came another, and another. "Failed login attempt S. Brookfield at Gmail. Com. Failed login attempt S. Brookfield_cloud. They weren't hitting the company. They were hitting me. Someone was systematically trying to crack every digital door I had. They were looking for a way in, checking to see if I had uploaded the contents of the drive to a cloud server. I didn't panic. I watched the attempts bounce off my 2-factor authentication like hail off a tin roof. But it was a warning. The invisible hand of my family was reaching out, trying to strangle me. That evening, as I drove home, I noticed a gray sedan 3 cars back. It made every turn I made. When I pulled into the parking garage of my building, it lingered at the entrance for a moment before driving on. It was sloppy surveillance, likely a cheap private investigator hired by Vince. They were watching my physical movements now, trying to see if I went to a bank, or a lawyer, or a safe deposit box. I parked and sat in my car for a moment, gripping the steering wheel. My heart was hammering, but not from fear. It was adrenaline. They were reacting exactly as Eleanor had predicted. They were hungry, and hunger made them careless. My phone buzzed in the cup holder. Unknown number. I picked it up but didn't speak. I just listened. For 10 seconds, there was only the sound of breathing. Then, a low, breathy laugh. It was unmistakable. Tiffany. "You don't think you can keep it, do you?" she whispered. Her voice was syrupy, laced with venom. "You're just a little nerd. Sharon, you don't know how to play with the big kids. Mama is really mad. You don't want to see Mama mad." "Tiffany," I said, my voice calm, "if you have something to say it to my lawyer." "Lawyer," she cackled. "You can't afford a lawyer. Not against us. Just give it back. Sharon, be a good cousin, or things are going to get messy." The line clicked dead. I stared at the phone, a threat. They had moved from investigation to intimidation. The next morning, I went to see Arthur Blackwood. His office was a sanctuary of old-world power, smelling of leather and lemon polish. He sat behind his desk, looking even more grave than usual. He didn't offer me coffee. He offered me a grim reality check. "They are moving fast. Sharon," he said, sliding a document across the desk. "This was filed this morning." I picked up the paper. It was a draft of a lawsuit. Motion to contest validity of testamentary document. "They are arguing that Eleanor was mentally incompetent," Blackwood explained, removing his glasses and rubbing the bridge of his nose. "They claim that her decision to leave the bulk of her estate, or at least the key to it, to a minor relation is evidence of dementia. They are lining up 3 different doctors who are willing to testify that she was losing her faculties in the final months." "That is a lie," I said, my hand tightening on the paper. "She was sharp as a tack until the second she died." "It doesn't matter what is true," Blackwood said gently. "It matters what they can prove in court. And they have the money to drag this out for years. Their strategy is simple: freeze everything. If the judge grants an injunction, the shadow fund gets locked down. You won't be able to move a cent. They will starve you out." He looked at me with those waiting eyes again. "They want to invalidate the will so the estate reverts to the standard laws of succession, in which case Richard gets everything, and you get nothing." I put the paper down. "They are trying to declare her insane to steal her legacy." "Yes." "They are willing to tarnish her memory, to call her a senile old woman, just to get their hands on the money." "Yes." I felt a cold rage settle in my gut. It was distinct from the anger I felt for myself. This was for Eleanor. They could insult me all they wanted, but they would not rewrite history to make her look weak. "They think I am playing defense," I said, looking up at Blackwood. "Are you?" he asked. "No," I said. "I am done hiding. If they want a fight, I will give them one, but not the one they expect." I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city. Somewhere down there, Richard was screaming at his lawyer. Tiffany was laughing at her own cruelty. Margot was likely bribing a doctor to perjure himself. "They want the USB drive," I said. "That is their focus. They think it is the magic wand. They don't know about the physical archive. They don't know I have already signed the transfer deeds." "They suspect the driver holds the keys," Blackwood agreed. "If they get it, and they crack it." "They won't crack it," I said, "but I don't want them to stop looking for it. I want them focused on the wrong target." I turned back to Blackwood. "I need you to prepare a document," I said, "a specific kind of settlement agreement." Blackwood raised an eyebrow. "You want to settle?" "No," I said, a small, dangerous smile touching my lips. "I want to bait the trap. They think I'm a scared little data analyst who is in over her head. They think I am weak. So I am going to be weak. I am going to be exactly what they want me to be." "Sharon," Blackwood warned, "be careful. Richard is a blunt instrument, but he is heavy. If he swings and connects—" "He won't connect," I said, "because he is swinging at a ghost." I left Blackwood's office with a plan forming in my mind. It was risky. It required me to walk directly into the lion's den. It required me to let them see me bleed. Just a little. I drove to an electronics store in the suburbs. I bought a cheap 2-gigabyte USB drive that looked almost identical to the one Eleanor had left me. I bought a bottle of gray model paint and some sandpaper. Back in my apartment, I spent the evening crafting a forgery. I scuffed the new drive until it looked old and worn. I painted the casing to match the scratches on the original. I used a label maker to print a faded 2 GB sticker. Then, I sat down at my computer. I didn't load the new drive with the Fibonacci sequence. I didn't load it with keys. I wrote a simple program. It was a nasty little piece of code. A logic bomb that I had designed years ago for a penetration testing simulation. It was designed to look like an encrypted partition, but the moment someone tried to brute force the password, it wouldn't unlock. Instead, it would execute a command to silently copy the contents of the host computer's hard drive and send it to a remote server, my server, before wiping itself clean. I loaded the virus onto the fake drive. I held it up to the light. It looked perfect. It looked like trash. My phone buzzed again. Another unknown number. I didn't answer it this time. I didn't need to. I knew who it was, and I knew what they wanted. I was going to give it to them. I picked up my phone and dialed the one number I had sworn never to call. "Hello." Richard's voice was gruff, impatient. "Uncle Richard," I said, letting my voice tremble just enough to sound terrified. "It is Sharon." "Sharon," he said, and I could practically hear the shark smile spreading across his face. "So nice of you to finally call. We were just talking about you." "I don't know what is happening," I stammered. "My bank account is acting weird. People are following me. I'm scared. Uncle Richard." "Calm down, Sharon," he cooed, his voice dripping with false paternal concern. "It is probably just a misunderstanding. You know how complicated these legal things can get." "I don't want any trouble," I said, injecting a sob into my voice. "I just want it to stop. Tiffany said you guys were mad." "We aren't mad, honey," Richard lied. "We are just worried. Grandma left you that drive, and we think it might contain some important family documents. Things that are too heavy for a young girl to worry about." "I don't understand the files on it," I said. "It just looks like numbers. I don't want it. If I give it to you, will you make the bad men stop following me?" There was a pause on the other end. He was savoring the victory. He thought I had broken. "Of course, Sharon," he said soothingly. "We are family. We protect our own. Why don't you come over for dinner tomorrow night? Just a small family gathering. Bring the drive. We will sort everything out, and I will write you a nice check for your trouble. How does $50,000 sound for a new car?" "50,000, I breathed. "Okay, yes, thank you, Uncle Richard." "Tomorrow at 7, he said. "Don't be late." I hung up. The tremble in my voice vanished instantly. I looked at the fake USB drive in my hand. $50,000. He thought he could buy a billion-dollar legacy for the price of a mid-range sedan. He thought I was stupid. I put the fake drive in my pocket. The real drive was locked in a biometric safe bolt secured to the floor of my closet. Tomorrow, I will walk into his house. I would let them humiliate me one last time. I would let them think they had stripped me bare. And then, I would hand them the very thing that would destroy them. The vultures were circling, but they didn't realize the carcass was poisoned. The art of war is not about overwhelming force. It is about deception. It is about convincing your enemy that you are weak when you are strong, and that you are retreating when you are actually leading them into a kill box. For the past 24 hours, I had ceased to be Sharon Vance, the heir to a billion-dollar empire. I had reverted to Sharon Brookfield, the overwhelmed, incompetent data entry clerk who was terrified of her own shadow. I chose a coffee shop 3 blocks from Vanguard Data Systems for my opening performance. It was crowded, noisy, and perfectly illuminated for the man sitting in the gray sedan across the street. I knew he was there. I had clocked him the moment I left my apartment building. He was using a long-range directional microphone, likely pointing it at the glass window where I sat. I pulled out my phone and dialed the automated customer service line for my internet provider, just to have a voice on the other end to yell at. "I cannot believe this," I shouted, making sure my voice carried over the din of the espresso machines. I held the phone away from my ear, feigning frustration. "I am looking at these files right now, and they make no sense. It is just a bunch of random numbers and 0x whatever code. I think the drive is corrupted." I paused. listening to the robot on the other end tell me about billing options, then continued my monologue for the unseen audience. "My uncle wants it," I said, pitching my voice to sound whiny and desperate. "Maybe I should just give it to him. I don't know what to do with it. It is stressing me out. I just want to go back to work." I hung up and put my head in my hands, rubbing my temples theatrically. To anyone watching, I looked like a woman on the verge of a nervous breakdown. I looked like prey that had been separated from the herd. The report must have reached Richard within the hour. The strategy shifted immediately. The brute force login attempts on my account stopped. The menacing phone calls from Tiffany ceased. They had confirmed what they wanted to believe, that I was too stupid to solve the puzzle, and too weak to hold on to the prize. They didn't need to break me anymore. They just needed to buy me. The invitation came via a courier at 2 p.m. It was a heavy cream envelope with the Brookfield crest embossed in gold leaf. "Family dinner. 7 o'clock. Richard's estate. Let us put this behind us." I stared at the card. It wasn't an invitation. It was a summons to the slaughter. I arrived at the estate at exactly 7 o'clock. I drove my 7-year-old Honda, parking it between Richard's Bentley and Tiffany's bright yellow Porsche. The contrast was stark, a visual representation of the hierarchy they believed in. I had dressed for the role. I wore a faded gray dress that I hadn't worn in years, one that was slightly too loose, making me look smaller and frailer than I actually was. I wore no makeup. I pulled my hair back into a messy, low ponytail. I wanted to look tired. I wanted to look defeated. The butler, a man who had looked down on me since I was 5 years old, opened the door. "Good evening. Miss Sharon?" he said, his tone suggesting that I was delivering a pizza rather than attending a dinner. "They are in the drawing room." I walked down the long marble hallway. The house smelled of lilies and old money. It was a beautiful cage, filled with art Richard didn't understand and books Margot had never read. When I entered the drawing room, the tableau was perfect. Richard stood by the fireplace, holding a crystal tumbler of scotch. Margot was lounging on the sofa, flipping through a fashion magazine. Tiffany was texting in the corner. Vince, the lawyer, was hovering near the wet bar like a vulture waiting for scraps. Sharon Richard boomed, his face arranging itself into a mask of jovial warmth. He crossed the room and enveloped me in a hug that smelled of expensive cologne and tobacco. I let my body go limp, playing the part of the reluctant, frightened niece. "I am so glad you came," he said, releasing me and holding me at arm's length. "We hate to see you upset. Family shouldn't fight. Should we?" "No, Uncle Richard," I said, keeping my eyes on the floor. "I just want things to go back to normal." "Of course you do," Margot chimed in. She didn't stand up. She patted the spot next to her on the sofa. "Come sit. Darling, you look positively drained. Are you eating enough? You know stress is terrible for the complexion." I sat down, keeping my knees pressed together, clutching my purse in my lap as if it contained my soul. "We just want to help you." "Sharon," Tiffany said, looking up from her phone. She offered me a smile that didn't reach her eyes. It was the smile of a shark that had just smelled blood. "We know Grandma put a lot of pressure on you with that weird box. She was not herself at the end." "She wasn't crazy," I whispered, defending Eleanor just enough to make my capitulation feel real. No, certainly not," Richard said quickly, pouring me a glass of water. "But she was eccentric, and she left you a burden. That drive. It is just old files. Sharon, boring business records from the 90s. Nothing you need to worry about your pretty little head about." He sat down in the armchair opposite me, leaning forward, his elbows on his knees. "Look, Sharon, I know you are struggling. I know the rent in the city is high, and that car of yours, well, it has seen better days." He pulled a checkbook out of his jacket pocket. The sound of the leather cover opening was loud in the silent room. "I want to take that burden off your hands," he said softly. "I want to buy the drive from you, and the rest of the papers in that box. Just for sentimental value. I want to archive my mother's work properly." He uncapped a gold pen and wrote quickly. He tore the check out and slid it across the coffee table toward me. $50,000, he said. I stared at the check, It was more money than I made in 8 months at Vanguard. To the old Sharon, the one they thought they knew. This would have been a fortune. You can get a new car, Margot suggested sweetly, or perhaps move into a building with a doorman. It is dangerous out there for a single woman. I reached out and touched the check. I let my hand tremble. And if I take this, I said, my voice barely whispers, you will leave me alone. No more people following me. No more phone calls. Richard's face hardened for a split second before returning to the mask of benevolence. He glanced at Vince. Of course, Sharon, he said, we just want the family legacy secure. Once I have the drive, there is no reason for us to be concerned. You can go back to your life. I took a deep breath, letting it shudder out of me. I reached into my purse. I pulled out the USB drive. It was the fake one I had crafted the night before. The gray paint was chipped, the casing scratched, the 2 GB sticker was peeling at the corner. To them, it looked exactly like the artifact Arthur Blackwood had handed me. Tiffany sat up straighter. Vince took a step forward. Richard's eyes locked onto the piece of plastic with a hunger that was almost obscene. Okay, I said, I don't want it. It is just numbers. I held it out, but then I pulled it back. Wait, I said. Richard froze. What is it? Sharon. Mr. Blackwood, I stammered. He said I have to be careful. He said if I give away assets, I need a receipt or a release. Vince scoffed. A receipt for a piece of junk. It is just, I don't want you to come back later and say I stole it, or that I owe you something. I said, widening my eyes, I just want to be safe. Richard waved his hand dismissively. Vince, draw something up. Whatever she wants. Just get it done. Vince sighed. Opening his briefcase, he pulled out a laptop and a portable printer. He typed for a few minutes, the click-clack of the keys the only sound in the room. Here, Vince said, handing me a sheet of paper a few minutes later. It is a standard release of claims. It says that in exchange for the delivery of the contents of the bequest known as Basement Archive No. 4, the Brookfield family agrees to hold you harmless and waives any right to contest your ownership of any other assets designated to you by the estate. I read the paper. Vince had written it quickly, and his arrogance had made him sloppy. He thought he was writing a document that protected me from them suing me for $50,000. But the wording was broad. Waives any right to contest your ownership of any other assets designated to you by the estate. They thought the only asset designated to me was the box of trash. They didn't know that I had already signed the deeds for Aegis Holdings. They didn't know that the Shadow Fund was now legally an asset designated to me. By signing this, they were legally agreeing that they could not challenge my ownership of the billion-dollar fund, even if they later found out about it. It was a circular legal trap. If they tried to sue me later to get the Shadow Fund, this document would be Exhibit A in their dismissal. Is this okay? I asked, pretending to struggle with the legal jargon. It is fine. Sharon, Richard snapped, losing patience. It just says we are done. We take the drive, you take the money, and we never talk about this again. Sign it. I signed my name at the bottom. Then I pushed the paper toward Richard. You too, Uncle Richard, and Aunt Margot, and Tiffany. We are all family, right? They rolled their eyes. They thought I was being petty. They thought I was a bureaucracy-obsessed little clerk. Richard signed with a flourish. Margot signed with a delicate scrawl. Tiffany signed with a huff of annoyance. I took the document and folded it carefully, placing it in my purse. Then, I placed the USB drive on the coffee table. Richard snatched it up before it even stopped sliding. He held it like it was the Hope Diamond. Finally, he breathed. Vince, get the laptop. Let's see what the old witch was hiding. I stood up. Can I go now? Yes, go, Richard muttered, not even looking at me. He was already plugging the drive into Vince's high-end machine. I walked out of the drawing room. I didn't look back. I heard the chime of a computer recognizing a new device. I walked down the hallway, past the sneering butler. I stepped out into the cool night air. The heavy oak door clicked shut behind me. I walked to my car. I got in and locked the door. I put the key in the ignition, but I didn't turn it yet. I looked in the rearview mirror. My reflection stared back. The fear was gone. The hesitation was gone. The slump in my shoulders had vanished. Inside that house, Richard was about to open a folder on that drive. He would expect to find bank codes. Instead, he was about to unleash a polymorphic virus that would not only wipe his lawyer's hard drive, but would also silently beacon every password, every email, and every illicit file on that machine to my secure server before it self-destructed. I had given them exactly what they wanted, and in doing so, I had taken everything they had. I started the engine. The radio came on, playing a soft jazz tune. I touched the folded paper in my purse, the release form. It was worth more than the $50,000 check sitting next to it. It was my shield. And the virus I had just planted, that was my sword. The game is not over, I whispered to the empty car. But checkmate is inevitable. I shifted into gear and drove away, leaving the vultures to feast on the poisoned carcass I had left them. The euphoria of my victory lasted exactly 42 minutes. That was how long it took for the beacon from my malware to stop transmitting. I was sitting in my car, parked 3 blocks away from my apartment, watching the data stream on my laptop. The virus I had planted on the fake drive had executed perfectly. It had bypassed Vince's expensive but lazy antivirus software, copied the entire contents of his hard drive, and uploaded it to my secure server before wiping itself and his operating system from existence. I saw the file transfer complete. I saw the target neutralized flag. And then, silence. I closed my laptop. The silence was not peaceful. It was a deep breath before a scream. I knew what was happening in that drawing room. Richard would be staring at a black screen. Vince would be frantically tapping useless keys. And then, the realization would hit them. The mouse had not just stolen the cheese. She had burned down the kitchen. My phone did not ring. There were no angry texts, no threats. That was the first sign that the game had changed. When Richard thought I was weak, he was loud. Now that he knew I was dangerous, he went silent. The next morning, the war arrived at my front door, or rather, my office door. I arrived at Vanguard Data Systems at 8:30, just as I always did. I scanned my badge at the turnstile. Usually, it gave a cheerful beep and a green light. Today, it gave a harsh, discordant buzz. Red light. I frowned and tried again. Buzz. Miss Brookfield. I turned. 2 security guards were standing behind me. I knew them. I had bought Girl Scout cookies from the tall one's daughter. But today, they weren't smiling. They were standing with their hands on their belts, their faces hard. "Please come with us," the tall one said. "What is going on?" I asked, though a cold knot was already forming in my stomach. "Mr. Henderson wants to see you, now." They escorted me not to my desk, but to the VP of Operations office. The walk of shame. Heads turned. Whispers started. In the tech world, being walked by security is the equivalent of a public execution. Mr. Henderson was a man who had praised my code efficiency 3 days ago. Now, he wouldn't even look me in the eye. He slid a folder across his desk. "We received an anonymous tip at 4 this morning," he said. His voice clipped. It included logs suggesting that a user with your credentials has been siphoning proprietary client data and selling it on the dark web. "That is impossible," I said, my voice steady despite the shock. "Check the IP addresses. Check the timestamps. I have the highest security clearance here." "The logs look authentic." "Sharon," he said, finally looking at me. There was disappointment in his eyes, and fear. "And the tip came with a threat. If we don't act, the whistleblower goes public. Vanguard cannot afford a data scandal." "It is a frame-up," I said. "My family." "Leave your badge and your laptop," he interrupted. "You are placed on unpaid suspension pending a full forensic investigation. If these allegations are true, we will be pressing federal charges." I stood there, stripped of my career in under 5 minutes. Richard didn't just want to beat me. He wanted to unemploy me. He wanted to take away the one place where I had power. I handed over my badge. It felt like handing over a limb. I walked out of the building, the rain mixing with the hot shame on my face. I went to the coffee shop across the street, my hands shaking. I needed caffeine. I needed to think. I ordered a black coffee. I tapped my debit card on the reader. Declined. The barista looked at me with pity. Maybe the chip is dirty. Try again. I tried again. Declined. I pulled out my phone and opened my banking app. Account status. Frozen. Contact branch immediately. I dialed the bank. I spent 20 minutes on hold, listening to cheerful jazz while my world crumbled. When a representative finally answered, her voice was robotic. Ms. Brookfield, your accounts have been flagged for suspicious activity related to potential money laundering. A hold has been placed by the compliance department following a report from a legal entity. Vince, he had pulled strings. He had filed a suspicious activity report, likely citing the $50,000 check Richard had written me, the one I hadn't even cashed yet, as evidence of illicit funds. They were strangling me. No job, no money. Then came the social assassination. My phone started buzzing incessantly, not calls, but notifications. Instagram, Twitter, Facebook. I didn't use social media much, but suddenly I was tagged in everything. I opened Instagram. There was Tiffany. She was sitting in her bedroom, ring light reflecting in her teary eyes, wearing a modest sweater that she probably bought just for this performance. The caption read, "The truth about my grandmother's final days. Hashtag elder abuse. Hashtag justice for Eleanor." I clicked play. "Hi guys," Tiffany sniffled, wiping away a non-existent tear. "I haven't wanted to talk about this, but I can't stay silent anymore. My grandmother, Eleanor, was the strongest woman I knew, but in her final months she was confused, vulnerable. She took a shaky breath. We tried to protect her, but my cousin Sharon took advantage of that. She isolated Grandma. She manipulated her into signing things she didn't understand. And now she's trying to steal everything that Grandma built, leaving the rest of the family with nothing. She is even threatening my dad. It is just so hard to see someone you love be used like that." The comments were scrolling by faster than I could read. "What a monster! Find this Sharon girl and expose her gold digger. She should be in jail." It was a masterclass in weaponized victimhood. Tiffany had turned the narrative upside down. I wasn't the victim of a greedy family. I was the predator preying on the elderly. The internet didn't care about facts. It cared about tears and good lighting. I turned off my phone. I felt sick. They were dismantling my life, piece by piece. Identity, finances, reputation. I drove home, running on the fumes in my tank. I just wanted to get inside, lock the door, and regroup. But when I reached my apartment door, I saw that the sanctuary had been breached. The door was unlocked. The wood around the frame was splintered. I pushed it open. My apartment had been tossed, not searched, destroyed. My monitors were smashed. The screen's spider-webbed cracks. My books were pulled off the shelves. Pages torn out. My mattress was slashed. In the center of the room, on the floor amidst the wreckage of my life, was a single sheet of paper. It was pinned to the floor with a kitchen knife. Written in thick black marker were 3 words: "We aren't done." I stood in the ruins of my home. The glass crunched under my boots. The smell of violence was heavy in the air. This wasn't a warning. This was an eviction. They were telling me that I was safe nowhere. If I stayed here, the next time they came, they wouldn't just break furniture. I didn't cry. The time for crying had passed in the lawyer's office. Now, there was only cold, hard calculus. I went to the closet. The biometric safe bolt secured to the floor was scratched and dented. They had tried to pry it open with a crowbar, but it had held. Eleanor's real legacy was safe. I opened it. I took out the real USB drive. I took out my backup hard drive. I packed a bag with the few clothes that hadn't been destroyed. I walked out of the apartment. I didn't bother locking the broken door. There was nothing left to steal. I drove south. The city lights faded behind me, replaced by the industrial gloom of the harbor district. The rain started again, washing away the traces of the world I used to live in. I pulled up to the warehouse. The sign still read, "Vance Logistics, closed." It looked desolate, abandoned, and perfect. I walked to the side door. I pressed my hand to the brick. The panel slid open. I let the scanner read my eye. Identity confirmed. The door hissed open. Silas was waiting for me in the airlock. He took one look at my face, at the bag in my hand, and he didn't ask what happened. He knew. "The guest quarters are set up," he said simply. "We have food, water, and an encrypted satellite link." "They froze my accounts," I said, stepping inside. "They got me fired. They turned the internet against me. They trashed my apartment." "Standard operating procedure for a scorched earth campaign," Silas said, locking the door behind us. "They are trying to shock you into submission. They want you to come crawling back, begging for $50,000. We walked through the server room. The hum of the machines was louder tonight. Or maybe my hearing was just sharper. It sounded like a hive of angry bees. We went up to the glass office. I threw my bag in the corner. I looked at the desk where Eleanor used to sit. "I am done playing the victim, Silas," I said. "Good," he replied. "Because you are not a victim. You are the CEO of Aegis Holdings." I sat in the leather chair. I opened the black accordion folder Silas had given me the insurance file. I looked at the documents, the proof of Richard's money laundering, Margot's bribery, Tiffany's tax evasion. "Do we drop the bomb?" Silas asked, his hand resting on the desk. "Do we send the whole file to the FBI?" "No," I said. "Not yet. If we arrest them now, they become martyrs. They will claim it is part of my vendetta. They will use their lawyers to muddy the waters. I need to bleed them first. I need them to be running scared, making mistakes, and turning on each other." I pulled out a single document. It wasn't the most incriminating thing in the file, but it was embarrassing. It was a series of invoices from a shell company Richard used to hide losses from his shareholders. It showed that he had spent $200,000 of company money on consulting fees that were actually payments to a high-end escort service in Vegas. It was petty, it was sleazy, and it was perfect. "Phase 2, I said. I fired up the terminal. I routed my connection through the Tor network, bouncing my signal off servers in Estonia and Brazil. I found the email address for an investigative journalist at the Seattle Times, a woman named Reynolds who had been trying to dig dirt on the Brookfield family for years. I scanned the document. I attached it to a blank email. Subject: a tip regarding Brookfield Logistics. Body follow the money. There is more where this came from. I hit send. "That is just a paper cut," Silas observed. "Yes," I said, watching the confirmation message appear. "But sharks can smell blood in the water from a mile away. And Richard, he is swimming with piranhas. Once the shareholders see this, the stock will wobble. He will panic. And when he panics, he will reach for the money he thinks he has." I leaned back in the chair. The warehouse was a fortress, impenetrable and cold. Outside, the rain lashed against the metal roof. Let them come. Let them smash my windows and freeze my cards. They were fighting a girl who lived in an apartment. That girl was gone. Now they were fighting the ghost in the machine. The morning headlines were beautiful. I sat in the glass office of the warehouse, sipping stale coffee from a styrofoam cup, watching the world react to the pebble I had thrown into the pond. On the main monitor, the front page of the Financial Daily was displayed in high definition. The headline was bold, black, and damning: Brookfield Logistics CEO implicated in fund misappropriation scandal. It wasn't a death blow, not yet. The article, written by the tenacious Reynolds, carefully used words like alleged and documents suggest, but the damage was done. The stock ticker for Brookfield Logistics, which I had been monitoring on a side screen, was bleeding red. It had dropped 12% since the opening bell. This was data forensics in action. A single invoice, placed in the right hands, could do more damage than a bomb. Silas walked in, carrying a tablet. "The market is reacting," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "Shareholders are calling for an audit. The board of directors has scheduled an emergency meeting for noon." "Richard won't go to the meeting," I said, leaning forward. "He is too arrogant to face them. He will try to buy his way out first." I switched the view on my monitor to the internal banking logs of Aegis Holdings. because I was the administrator of the shell company that ultimately controlled Richard's assets. I had a god's eye view of his financial desperation. At 9:15, a request came through. Sell order 50,000 shares, Brookfield Logistics, executed by R. Brookfield. He was trying to liquidate. He needed cash to bribe board members, to pay off Reynolds, or perhaps just to fill the hole the consulting fees had left in the company accounts. I watched the request hover in the queue. The system was automated, designed to process trades instantly, but I had inserted a new rule into the algorithm last night. Condition if user equals R, Brookfield, then status equals denied. I hit the enter key. On the screen, the request flashed red. Transaction failed. Asset frozen by administrator. I imagined Richard in his study, staring at his screen. He would be clicking the mouse furiously, as if physical force could override digital logic. He would call his broker. The broker would tell him the system was locking them out. 10 minutes later, another request. Transfer request. $5 million from offshore holding B to personal checking, executed by R. Brookfield, via V. Miller attorney. He was trying to tap the offshore accounts again. He still didn't understand. He thought the glitch from before had been fixed. I denied it. Transaction failed. Insufficient privileges. Contact Aegis Holdings Administrator. He is seeing the name now, Silas said, looking over my shoulder. Aegis Holdings. He has never heard of it. He thinks he owns the companies, I said. He doesn't know he only owns the paper the shares are printed on. Aegis owns the structure. Richard and Vince would be frantic. They were watching their net worth evaporate in real time, and every lifeline they reached for was being cut by an invisible hand. They would be searching for Aegis Holdings right now. They would find nothing but a P.O. box in Delaware and a registered agent in Panama. They were fighting a ghost. Time to divide and conquer, I said. I opened a new window. This one contained the insurance files section on Aunt Margot. Margot was not a businesswoman. She was a survivor. She stayed with Richard because he funded her lifestyle and her vanity, if that funding was threatened. Her loyalty would dissolve like sugar in hot tea. But more than money, Margot cared about pride. I pulled up a document I had scanned earlier. It was a bank statement from Richard's private slush fund, the one he used for his gambling debts. But looking closely at the transfers, I had found a pattern. Every month, a transfer of $10,000 went to an account named LV Design. Margot thought LV Design was her interior decorator, but I had traced the routing number. It belonged to a luxury condo in downtown Seattle, and the tenant was not a decorator. She was a 22-year-old fitness instructor named Lexi. And the worst part, the money Richard was using to pay for Lexi's condo wasn't his. It was coming from a joint trust account he shared with Margot specifically. The fund Margot had set aside for her future maintenance. He was stealing from his wife to pay his mistress. I drafted an email to Margot's personal address. I didn't add text. I just attached the bank statement, highlighting the transfers, and a photo of Lexi entering the condo with Richard. Subject: check your balance. Sent? That is cruel, Silas noted. They destroyed my apartment, I replied, not looking away from the screen. They tried to destroy my name. This isn't cruelty. Silas, it is transparent. The reaction was almost immediate. According to the security logs from the estate which Silas had tapped into Margot's phone activity, spiked. Then, the landline in the house was used to call Richard's cell phone. The call lasted 40 seconds. Then, the credit card alert started. Tiffany's card was declined at a spa in Beverly Hills. Then Richard's card was declined at a liquor store. Margot froze the joint assets, Silas said, a rare smirk appearing on his face. She called the bank and reported fraud. Chaos, I said. Richard is fighting the board. He is fighting me. And now, he is fighting his wife. He is surrounded. It was time for the final maneuver. I picked up the secure satellite phone and dialed Arthur Blackwood. Mr. Blackwood, I said when he answered. It is time. Are you sure, Sharon? His voice was heavy with concern. Once we file this, there is no going back. We are inviting them into the arena. They are already in the arena, I said. They just don't know there is a lion in there with them. File the emergency protection order and request a summary judgment hearing regarding the execution of the will. On what grounds? On the grounds that the beneficiaries have violated the non-contest clause, I said. And I want it public. I want a courtroom. I want a judge. They will bring an army of lawyers, Blackwood warned. They will try to bury you in motion. Let them bring their army, I said. I am bringing the truth. By 2 o'clock that afternoon, the filing was in the system. Sharon Vance versus the estate of Eleanor Vance et al. The notification would hit Vince's desk within the hour. I could see it, the war room at the estate. Richard, red-faced and screaming about the stock price. Margot, icy and venomous, throwing vases because of the mistress. Tiffany, crying because her credit card didn't work. And then, the lawsuit lands. They would stop fighting each other for a moment. They would look at the paper, and they would laugh. She wants a hearing, Richard would say, wiping sweat from his forehead. She wants to go to court against us. She is suicidal. Vince would agree. We have the doctors ready to testify that Eleanor was insane. We have the evidence that Sharon is a thief. We will crush her. We will countersue for defamation and emotional distress. They would see this as their salvation. A court case was something they understood. It was a game of money and influence. They thought they could buy the judge, intimidate the jury, and outspend the orphan. They didn't know that the courtroom was exactly where I wanted them. Because in a courtroom, evidence is entered into the public record. In a courtroom, perjury is a felony. In a courtroom, you cannot hide behind a PR team or a shell company. I stood up and walked to the edge of the glass office, looking down at the blinking lights of the servers. Silas, I said, prepare the extraction. Extraction. We are leaving the warehouse, I said. I can't walk into court looking like a fugitive. I need to look like the heir. Where are we going? To the one place they won't look, I said. My grandmother's beach house, the one Margot thinks she inherited. Margot has the keys, Silas said. I have the deeds, I corrected, and I have a locksmith. I went back to the desk and picked up the black folder. I slid the new evidence, the stock manipulation logs, the bank fraud records into the file. I looked at the screen one last time. Brookfield Logistics stock was down 18%. The family was imploding. The trap was set. I turned off the monitor. The reflection in the black glass wasn't the scared girl in the gray cardigan anymore. It was a woman who knew the value of patience. Let's go, I said. I have a suit to buy. The Seattle Superior Court was a cathedral of judgment, a place of mahogany pews and echoing footsteps where lives were dismantled with the strike of a gavel. The air inside smelled of floor wax and anxiety, while my family sat on the right side of the aisle, looking like a royal court in exile. I sat on the left, next to Arthur Blackwood. I was no longer the girl in the gray cardigan. I was wearing a tailored navy suit that cost more than my first car, bought with the credit line Silas had opened for me through Aegis Holdings. My hair was pulled back in a severe, sharp bun. I sat with my spine pressed against the back of the chair, my hands resting on the table. Perfectly still. Across the aisle, Richard looked like a man who had already won. He was whispering to his lead counsel, a man named Garrett Sterling. Sterling was the kind of lawyer you hired when you wanted to burn the earth. He was known as the Bulldog of the Pacific Northwest, a man who charged $1,000 an hour to destroy reputations. Margot was checking her makeup in a compact mirror, seemingly bored. Tiffany was staring at the ceiling, looking annoyed that she had to be awake before noon. They didn't look at me. To them, I was already a memory, a nuisance they were about to swat away. All rise, the bailiff bellowed. Judge Elena Rossi swept into the room. She was a formidable woman with a reputation for zero tolerance for theatrics. She took her seat, adjusted her glasses, and looked down at the filings. We are here for a summary judgment hearing in the matter of the estate of Eleanor Vance, Judge Rossi said. The plaintiffs are alleging that the decedent was mentally incompetent at the time of the will's execution and that the defendant, Ms. Brookfield, exercised undue influence. Mr. Sterling, you may proceed. Sterling stood up, buttoning his suit jacket. He walked to the center of the room, exuding a predatory confidence. Your Honor, Sterling began, his voice booming. This case is a tragedy. It is the story of a brilliant woman, a titan of industry, whose mind was failing her in her final days. And it is the story of a granddaughter who saw an opportunity to exploit that decline. He turned and pointed a finger at me. It was a practiced gesture, designed to make the jury, or in this case, the judge, look at me with suspicion. Sharon Brookfield is a woman with a history of instability, Sterling continued. Just this week, she was suspended from her position at Vanguard Data Systems for alleged theft of proprietary data. She is desperate. She is financially insolvent, and when she saw her grandmother slipping away, she whispered poison into her ear. She convinced a confused old woman to cut out her own son, her own flesh and blood, in favor of a stranger. Richard nodded solemnly, dabbing his eyes with a handkerchief. It was a performance worthy of an Academy Award. We have affidavits from 3 physicians, Sterling said, waving a sheaf of papers. They state that Eleanor Vance showed signs of paranoia and cognitive decline. We have testimony from the family that Ms. Brookfield controlled access to the deceased, isolating her. We ask the court to invalidate the current will and revert the estate to the standard laws of succession. He paused for effect. Furthermore, we ask for a restraining order against Ms. Brookfield, who has shown erratic and threatening behavior toward my client since the reading of the will. Sterling sat down, looking satisfied. Richard patted him on the back. Tiffany suppressed a yawn. Judge Rossi turned to our table. Mr. Blackwood? Arthur Blackwood stood up. He moved slowly, with the weight of 40 years of law behind him. He didn't have Sterling's flash. He had something better. He had the truth. Your Honor, Blackwood said, his voice quiet but carrying to the back of the room. I do not intend to waste the court's time debating the mental state of Eleanor Vance. Her medical records, which I have submitted to the bench, show that she was lucid and commanding until her final breath, but that is not why we are here. He walked to the podium and placed a single, thick document on it. I am here to enforce the terms of the will, specifically, a sealed addendum that was to be triggered only under specific conditions. Conditions that the plaintiffs have, unfortunately for them, met in spectacular fashion. Richard frowned. He leaned over to Vince, his personal lawyer who was sitting behind the rail, and whispered something. Vince shook his head, looking confused. Eleanor Vance knew her family, Blackwood said. She knew them better than they knew themselves. She anticipated that they would contest the will. She anticipated that they would attack the character of the person she chose to carry on her legacy, and so she included Clause 88, the behavioral clause. Blackwood opened the document. I quote, "If any beneficiary challenges the validity of this testament or engages in acts of harassment, defamation, or physical intimidation against the appointed manager of the shadow fund, they shall immediately forfeit their entire inheritance. Furthermore, they shall be liable for restitution of any assets already distributed." The room went silent. Richard stopped whispering. Margot lowered her compact mirror. "The shadow fund?" Judge Rossi asked, raising an eyebrow. "I do not see that entity listed in the primary asset schedule." "It is a private equity trust," Blackwood explained, "and the identity of its manager was kept confidential for security reasons. However, the clause is clear. Attacks on the manager trigger the forfeiture." "And who is this manager?" Sterling interrupted, standing up. "This is a fabrication, Your Honor. A phantom entity designed to block my client's rightful claims." "We will get to the identity in a moment," Blackwood said coldly. "First, let us establish if harassment and defamation has occurred." Blackwood nodded to the court clerk. "Exhibit A, please." The speakers in the courtroom crackled. Then, Tiffany's voice filled the room. "You don't think you can keep it, do you? You're just a little nerd. Sharon Mama is really mad. You don't want to see Mama mad. Tiffany gasped, covering her mouth. Her face went pale. Exhibit B, Blackwood continued. A video played on the large monitor mounted on the wall. It was grainy footage from the hallway security camera of my apartment building. It showed two men in hoodies breaking down my door. One of them paused to check his phone. The screen was zoomed in. The text message on the phone screen was visible. The boss says break everything, leave the note. The number sending the text was displayed. We have traced this number, Blackwood said. It belongs to a burner phone purchased by Mr. Vincent Miller, the personal attorney for Mr. Richard Brookfield. Vince, sitting in the gallery, made a sound like a dying balloon. He slumped in his seat, realizing he had just been implicated in a felony. And finally, Blackwood said, his voice hardening, Exhibit C? He held up the piece of paper I had tricked them into signing at the dinner party. The plaintiffs claim they are contesting the will because they believe it is invalid. Yet, 2 nights ago, they invited Ms. Brookfield to their home. They offered her $50,000 to purchase a USB drive, and in exchange, they signed this. Blackwood projected the document onto the screen. Agrees to hold Sharon Brookfield harmless and waives any right to contest her ownership of any other assets designated to you by the estate. They signed a waiver, Blackwood said. They acknowledged her ownership, they bought what they thought was the key to the estate, and they signed away their right to sue. By filing this lawsuit today, they are not only in breach of the behavioral clause, they are in breach of their own contract signed 48 hours ago. Sterling grabbed the paper from his assistant. He read it. His face flushed a deep, angry red. He turned to Richard. You signed this, Sterling hissed, not caring who heard him. You signed a general release waiver without showing it to me. I thought it was just for the USB drive, Richard stammered, sweat beading on his forehead. Vince wrote it? Vince is an idiot, Sterling shouted. This is a circular trap. You admitted she owns the assets. You can't sue someone for stealing something you legally admitted they own. Order. Judge Rossi banged her gavel. Mr. Sterling, control your client. Sterling took a deep breath. He knew he was losing. He tried to pivot. Your Honor, Sterling said, his voice strained. This document refers to assets designated to Ms. Brookfield. My clients were under the impression that the only asset she possessed was a box of old papers. They did not know about this shadow fund. Therefore, the waiver is void due to lack of disclosure. Ignorance is not a defense when you draft the contract yourself, Judge Rossi said dryly. But let us return to the main issue. Mr. Blackwood, you claim the behavioral clause strips the plaintiffs of their inheritance if they attack the manager of the shadow fund. You have proven attacks on Miss Brookfield, but you have not established that Miss Brookfield is the manager. The judge leaned forward. If Ms. Brookfield is simply a beneficiary, the clause does not apply in the same way. The clause protects the manager. So, I ask you again, who manages this fund, and what proof do you have that these attacks were directed at the fund's administration? Richard looked at me. For the first time, I saw real fear in his eyes. He realized that the mouse was not in the trap. The mouse was the trap. Arthur Blackwood turned to me. He nodded. I stood up. My chair scraped against the floor, a harsh sound in the silent room. I smoothed the front of my jacket. I walked to the witness stand, not waiting to be called. I placed my hand on the Bible. I swore to tell the truth. State your name and occupation for the record, the clerk said. I looked at Richard. I looked at Margot. I looked at Tiffany. My name is Sharon Vance, I said, my voice steady and clear. I dropped the name Brookfield this morning. A ripple of whispers went through the room. And your occupation? Judge Rossi asked. I am the sole director and CEO of Aegis Holdings, I said, the parent company of the Shadow Fund. Richard laughed. It was a nervous, hysterical sound. He sputtered. She is a data entry clerk. She fixes computers. She doesn't run a billion-dollar fund. I have the transfer deeds, I said, pulling the documents from my briefcase. Signed and notarized. I have the private encryption keys. I have the control logs for the servers. I handed the folder to the bailiff, who passed it to the judge. Judge Rossi opened the folder. She scanned the documents. Her eyes widened slightly. She looked from the papers to me, and then to Richard. "The documentation appears to be in order," Judge Rossi said. "Ms. Vance is the legal administrator of the Shadow Fund." "That's impossible," Margot shrieked, standing up. "She tricked us. She is a liar." "Sit down, Mrs. Brookfield," the judge snapped. I turned to face them. "I didn't trick you," I said. "I let you be yourselves, and that was enough." I looked at the judge. "Your Honor, the behavioral clause is clear. They have defamed me publicly. They have physically attacked my home. They have attempted to sabotage my employment, and they have filed frivolous litigation to drain the estate's resources." I reached into my bag and pulled out the insurance file, the black accordion folder that Silas had given me. "But I am not just asking for them to be disinherited," I said. "I am submitting evidence to the court regarding the source of the funds they are currently using to pay for this lawsuit." I placed the black folder on the judge's bench. "This file contains evidence of embezzlement, tax fraud, and bribery committed by Richard and Margot Brookfield over the last 10 years, I said. "They have been using the company's logistics accounts to launder money. They have been using the family trust to pay bribes to city officials, and Tiffany Brookfield has been claiming personal luxury expenses as tax-deductible charitable donations." Sterling froze. He looked at the black folder like it was a bomb. He realized instantly that if that folder was opened, his retainer check was going to bounce. "Objection," Sterling yelled. "This is irrelevant. This is the reason my grandmother created the Shadow Fund," I interrupted, my voice rising for the first time. "She knew they were criminals. She knew they would destroy the legacy. She gave me the authority to stop them, and she gave me the evidence to bury them." Judge Rossi put her hand on the black folder. She looked at Richard. "Miss Sterling," the judge said, her voice dangerously low, "if half of what is in this folder is true, your clients are not just losing a civil case, they are facing federal indictments." Richard stood up, his face purple. He pointed a shaking finger at me. "You little witch," he screamed. "You ungrateful, miserable little stray. We took you in, we fed you. And this is how you repay us, by stealing my money." "It was never your money, Richard," I said calmly. "It was hers, and now it is mine." "I will kill you." Richard lunged. It happened in slow motion. He scrambled over the wooden rail, his face twisted in a rictus of hate. Margot screamed. Tiffany covered her eyes. But he never reached me. The bailiffs were on him before he took 2 steps. They slammed him onto the table, twisting his arms behind his back. "Get off me," he roared. "Do you know who I am? I am Richard Brookfield." "You are under arrest," the bailiff said, clicking handcuffs onto his wrists, "for assault and threatening a witness in open court." I stood there, watching him struggle. I didn't flinch. I didn't step back. Margot was sobbing now, clutching her pearls. Tiffany was looking at her phone, frantically deleting posts, realizing her social media campaign was about to become evidence in a criminal trial. Judge Rossi banged her gavel, the sound echoing like a gunshot. "This court finds in favor of the defendant, Sharon Vance," she ruled. "The motion to contest the will is dismissed with prejudice. The behavioral clause is invoked. The plaintiffs are hereby stripped of all rights to the Brookfield estate, and—" She tapped the black folder. "I am sealing this courtroom. The bailiff will escort Mr. and Mrs. Brookfield into custody pending a review of these documents by the district attorney." I looked at Richard one last time as they hauled him away. He looked back at me, his eyes filled with shock. He still couldn't believe it. He had played the game his whole life thinking he was the king. He never realized he was just a pawn. "It is over," Blackwood whispered beside me. "No," I said, picking up my briefcase. "The cleanup has just begun." The silence in Department 42 was absolute. It was not the quiet of a library. It was the vacuum of a crypt before the lid was sealed. The bailiffs had forced Richard back into his chair. Though his hands remained cuffed behind his back, he was panting, his face a mottled map of rage and terror. Beside him, Margot sat frozen, her perfect posture finally collapsing into a slump of genuine despair. Tiffany was chewing on her fingernail, destroying a manicure that cost $300, her eyes darting around the room like a trapped animal looking for a vent. Judge Rossi had not spoken for 4 minutes. She was reading. I stood at the witness stand, my hands resting on the cool wood. I did not fidget. I did not look at my family. I watched the judge. I watched her eyes scan the pages of the black file, the insurance policy that Silas and Eleanor had curated for 2 decades, and which I had weaponized in the last 48 hours. Every page she turned was the sound of a coffin nail being hammered home. Finally, Judge Rossi closed the folder. She took off her glasses and placed them on top of the black accordion file. When she looked up, her expression was no longer that of a civil court judge arbitrating a family squabble. It was the face of the law realizing it was sitting in the presence of rot. Mr. Sterling, the judge said. Her voice was terrifyingly soft. Sterling, the bulldog lawyer who had been so loud 10 minutes ago, stood up. He looked pale. He knew what was in that file. He knew that by representing them, he was dangerously close to becoming an accessory. Yes, Your Honor, Sterling whispered. Are you aware of the contents of these documents? She asked. I have not reviewed them. Your Honor, they were just introduced into evidence. Then let me enlighten you, Judge Rossi said. She picked up the first document. This appears to be a ledger from a shell corporation called North Star Construction. It details payments totaling $4 million over the last 5 years for raw materials, concrete, steel, timber delivered to a site in the industrial district. She paused. I know that site, Mr. Sterling. It is a protected wetland. Nothing has been built there since 1990. Yet, according to these invoices signed by your client, Richard Brookfield, $4 million of shareholder money vanished into the mud. Richard let out a low, guttural noise. That is a lie, he shouted, straining against his cuffs. Those were legitimate feasibility studies. Quiet, the bailiff barked, pushing Richard down. It gets worse, Judge Rossi continued. Ignoring him, she picked up another sheet. Here we have a series of emails between Mrs. Margot Brookfield and the former head of the City Zoning Commission. They discuss a scholarship fund for the commissioner's son. Interestingly, the dates of these donations totaling $250,000 coincide exactly with the rezoning of the Brookfield Heights property from residential to commercial. Margot covered her mouth with a trembling hand. A sob escaped her, wet and ugly. And finally, the judge said, holding up a tax return, Miss Tiffany Brookfield, this document claims you donated $600,000 to a charity called the Feline Rescue Initiative. However, the bank records attached here show that the charity's registered address is a condominium in Cabo San Lucas, and the only signatory on the account is you. The courtroom erupted. The few reporters in the back row were typing furiously on their phones. The court clerk looked shocked. This is not a probate case anymore, Judge Rossi said, her voice turning to steel. This is a crime scene. She hit a button on her desk. The lights above the doors flashed red. Bailiff, seal the courtroom. No one leaves. I am holding the plaintiffs in contempt, but that is the least of their worries. I am ordering the immediate remand of Richard and Margot Brookfield into the custody of the Sheriff's Department, pending the arrival of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. You can't do this, Richard screamed. He stood up, knocking his chair over. The heavy wood clattered against the floor, sounding like a gunshot. This is a setup. That girl planted this. She is a hacker. She faked it all. Sit down. Mr. Brookfield, the judge ordered. But Richard was past listening. He was a man watching his entire universe implode. The $50 million was gone. The reputation was gone. The freedom was gone. He looked at me, and he saw the architect of his destruction. He didn't just lunge this time. He exploded. With a roar of pure, primal hatred, he threw his body weight against the bailiff holding him. The officer, taken by surprise, stumbled back. Richard broke free. He didn't run for the door. He ran for me. You bitch! He screamed. His face twisted into a mask of madness. Spittle flew from his mouth. "You ruined us, you ungrateful little parasite." The entire courtroom froze for a heartbeat. I saw him coming, a 200-pound man fueled by 30 years of entitlement and 5 minutes of ruin. I didn't flinch. I didn't step back. I didn't even blink. 2 deputies tackled him 5 feet from the witness stand. They hit him like linebackers, driving him into the carpet with a bone-crushing thud. "Get off me," Richard howled, his face pressed against the floor. He lifted his head, his eyes locking onto mine. They were wild, bloodshot, filled with a confusion he couldn't process. "She did this, that old witch Eleanor. She hated us. She was a demon, and you are her spawn. She was a witch." The word hung in the air, vibrating with his rage. Witch. It was the insult of a small mind, a mind that couldn't comprehend power unless it was supernatural. He couldn't accept that he had been outsmarted by a woman. So he had to believe he had been cursed by magic. I looked down at him. From my vantage point on the stand, he looked small. He looked like a child throwing a tantrum in a grocery store. I leaned into the microphone. The sound system amplified my breath, making it fill the room. "She wasn't a witch, Richard," I said. My voice was calm, conversational, as if I were explaining a simple error to a junior analyst. The room went deadly silent. Even Richard stopped struggling to listen. "She was a programmer," I said. "She built systems, she wrote logic, and she coded a failsafe for every bug in the software." I stared into his eyes. "You are the bug, Richard, and you just triggered a fatal error." Richard stared at me, his mouth opening and closing. The comprehension finally hit him. It wasn't magic. It wasn't luck. It was math. He had been calculated out of existence. "Get him out of here," Judge Rossi commanded, her voice shaking with suppressed anger. The deputies hauled Richard to his feet. He didn't scream anymore. He sagged, a puppet whose strings had been cut. They dragged him through the side door leading to the holding cells. Margot followed, weeping hysterically, flanked by 2 female officers. She didn't look at me. She was too busy mourning her life. The door slammed shut with a heavy metallic finality. The courtroom was quiet again, save for the hum of the air conditioning and the scratching of the stenographer's machine. Judge Rossi took a deep breath. She looked at me. There was a new respect in her eyes, and perhaps a touch of fear. "Ms. Vance," she said, "in light of the evidence presented and the triggering of the behavioral clause, I am issuing a summary judgment." She signed a paper with a sharp scratch of her pen. "All assets previously bequeathed to Richard, Margot, and Tiffany Brookfield are hereby seized and transferred to the sole custody of the Shadow Fund. Under the administration of Sharon Vance, the defendants are stripped of all claims to the estate. Furthermore, the court grants a permanent restraining order against all 3 parties." She banged the gavel. "Court is adjourned." I stepped down from the witness stand. My legs felt solid. My heartbeat was slow, steady. I walked back to the table and began packing my briefcase. "Sharon." The voice was small, trembling. I turned. Tiffany was standing there. She wasn't arrested yet. Her crimes were financial misdemeanors compared to her parents' felonies. But she looked like she had been physically beaten. Her mascara was running down her cheeks in black rivers. Her designer dress looked like a costume. She took a step toward me, her hands reaching out. "Sharon, please," she sobbed. "I didn't know. I swear I didn't know about money laundering. Daddy made me sign those papers. Mom told me to make that video." She grabbed the sleeve of my jacket. I looked at her hand. It was shaking. "We are sisters, basically," she pleaded, her eyes wide and desperate. "You can't let them take everything. I have nowhere to go. They froze my cards. They are going to take my car. Sharon, please, I am family." I looked at her hand on my sleeve. Then I looked at her face. I remembered the high school graduation she didn't invite me to. I remembered the Christmas dinners where I sat at the kids' table while she sat with the adults. I remembered the phone call 2 days ago. "You are just a little nerd." Sharon. I reached out and gently removed her hand from my arm. I brushed the fabric where she had touched me, as if removing a speck of dust. You aren't family, Tiffany, I said. My voice wasn't angry, it was just empty. You are a liability. Sharon, she wailed, falling to her knees on the courtroom floor. Please, I will do anything. Give me a job. Give me something. You have something, I said, looking down at her. You have a 2 GB USB drive. I left it on the table for you. I turned my back on her. Sharon, she screamed behind me. I walked down the center aisle. The reporters parted like the Red Sea. I pushed open the heavy double doors of the courtroom. The hallway outside was bright. Sunlight was streaming through the high windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. The air smelled of freedom. It smelled of rain and pavement and the sea. I didn't look back at the sobbing girl on the floor. I didn't look back at the closed door where my uncle was being fingerprinted. I walked toward the exit. I had $1 billion fund to manage. I had a legacy to rebuild, and for the first time in 32 years, the data was clean. The dust does not settle in a day. It takes time for the air to clear after a demolition, and that is exactly what the last week had been. A controlled, precise, and total demolition of the Brookfield dynasty. I sat in the waiting room of Sterling and Partners for the last time. It was quiet. The frantic energy of the trial had dissipated, replaced by the hushed efficiency of bureaucracy. The newspapers on the coffee table told the story better than I could. The headlines were no longer speculative. Brookfield heirs denied bail. FBI raids Medina estate assets seized. Tiffany Brookfield from influencer to outcast. It had been 7 days since Judge Rossi brought the gavel down. Richard and Margot were currently residing in the King County Correctional Facility, facing a federal indictment that included racketeering, wire fraud, and grand larceny. The district attorney was pushing for the maximum sentence, 20 years. They would be in their 70s before they saw the sky without a chain-link fence in the way. Tiffany had not been charged criminally, but her sentence was perhaps worse for someone of her constitution. She was bankrupt. The court had seized her car, her jewelry, and her accounts to pay for legal fees and restitution. She had been evicted from her condo. The last I heard, she was staying in a motel on the outskirts of Tacoma, trying to pawn her designer handbags. The internet, once her source of validation, had turned on her with the ferocity of a starving pack of wolves. She was trending, but the hashtags were not kind. The heavy oak door opened. Arthur Blackwood stood there. He looked tired, but for the first time in 20 years, the lines of tension around his mouth were gone. "They are ready for you, Sharon," he said. I walked into the conference room. It was the same room where this had all started. The same long table where Richard had laughed at my 2 GB USB drive. But today, the room was empty of snakes. It was just me, Blackwood, and a stack of documents that stood 6 inches high. "We have completed the asset recovery," Blackwood said, sitting down. "The liquidation of Richard and Margot's personal holdings is nearly complete. The seized properties, the cars, the stocks, the total value, after paying off their debts and the legal fees, comes to roughly $80 million. He pushed the stack toward me. "As the sole beneficiary under the invoked behavioral clause, this is legally yours. It is separate from the shadow fund. You can do whatever you want with it." I looked at the papers. $80 million. It was the money Richard had destroyed his soul to get. It was the money Margot had sold her dignity for. It felt tainted. It felt like it was covered in a thin layer of grease. I didn't even pick up the pen. "I don't want it," I said. Blackwood smiled. It was a small, knowing smile. "I suspected you might say that. Eleanor always said you had no taste for excess." "It is not about excess," I corrected him. "It is about cleaning the slate. If I keep this money, I am just the next Brookfield. I am just the next person hoarding wealth while the world burns." I reached into my briefcase and pulled out a single sheet of paper I had typed up the night before. "Eleanor wanted to change the world," I said. "She believed that technology was the great equalizer. She wanted women to have the same keys to the kingdom that men like Richard were born with." I slid the paper across the table. I want to donate 80% of the recovered assets, $64 million, to the Eleanor Vance Initiative. It will be a grant program focused on STEM education for underprivileged girls in the Pacific Northwest. I want to build labs. I want to fund scholarships. I want to find the next Sharon Brookfield before she gets stuck in a basement. Blackwood read the paper. He nodded slowly. And the remaining 20%. Keep 10% for the firm's retainer and legal fees, I said. You have earned it. Arthur, the final 10% goes into a maintenance trust for the Harbor District warehouse and the beach house. I want the servers kept cold and the roof kept tight. Done, Blackwood said. He began stamping the documents, the rhythmic thud echoing in the room. When he finished, he looked up. He held one final document in his hand. There is one last piece of business. Sharon, he said softly. The name. I looked at him. You are currently listed as Sharon Brookfield, he said. The name Brookfield is well. It is not what it used to be. The press is going to associate it with fraud and scandal for a generation. Do you wish to retain it? I thought about my father, Richard's younger brother. He had been a quiet man, kind but weak, crushed under the weight of his family's expectations. He had died young, perhaps from the stress of trying to be a Brookfield. I thought about Richard screaming in the courtroom. I thought about Tiffany's desperate, clawing plea. No, I said. The Brookfields are gone. They destroyed themselves. Then what shall I put on the deed? Blackwood asked, his pen hovering over the line. I looked out the window at the rain falling on the Seattle skyline. I saw the gray clouds, the steel buildings, and the resilience of the city. Vance, I said. Sharon Vance. Blackwood smiled, a genuine expression of warmth. Welcome back, Ms. Vance. I left the office an hour later. The rain felt different on my face. It wasn't oppressive anymore. It was cleansing. I drove to my old apartment in Capitol Hill. I needed to say goodbye to the ruin. The door was still boarded up with plywood, where the hired thugs had broken it down. I used my key to open the lock, pushing the heavy wood aside. The apartment smelled of stale air and violence. The smashed monitors were still on the floor. The slashed mattress was still overturned. I walked through the wreckage. I didn't feel fear. I felt like an archaeologist walking through the ruins of a civilization that had fallen. I went to the closet. The safe was empty, save for one thing. I reached in and pulled it out. It was a fake USB drive, the one I had given to Richard. The police had returned it to me in an evidence bag after they seized Richard's electronics. I took it out of the plastic bag. It looked so innocent. A piece of gray plastic that had brought down an empire. I walked to the kitchen. I opened the trash can. I dropped the drive into the garbage. It landed with a hollow click amongst the old coffee grounds and takeout containers. It belonged there. It was a tool for a job, and the job was done. Then, I reached into my pocket and pulled out the real drive, the one Eleanor had left me, the one that held the keys to the shadow fund. It was warm in my hand. I walked out of the apartment. I left the door unlocked. I left the keys on the counter. There was nothing there for me anymore. I got into my car and drove west. I left the city behind. The concrete gave way to pine trees, and the skyline gave way to the jagged coastline of the Pacific. I drove for 2 hours, the road winding along the cliffs, until I reached the private road that led to the Vance estate. It wasn't a mansion. Eleanor hated mansions. It was a sprawling, modern structure made of glass and cedar, perched on a cliff overlooking the churning gray ocean. It was isolated, windswept, and beautiful. I pulled into the driveway. The house had been empty for months, but the lights were on. Silas had been here. I walked up the stone steps and unlocked the front door. The house smelled of cedar and sea salt. It was silent, but it wasn't empty. It was filled with her presence. The books on the shelves, the telescope pointing out at the horizon, the heavy wooden chess set on the coffee table. I walked through the house, my footsteps echoing on the hardwood floors. I went out to the back deck. The wind hit me instantly, cold and bracing. The ocean stretched out before me, a vast, restless expanse of gray water meeting gray sky. It was wild and untamable. I sat down in the Adirondack chair Eleanor used to love. I opened my laptop. I had one last transaction to make. I logged into the Shadow Fund's secure interface. The numbers scrolled across the screen. A river of digital wealth that could buy small countries. $1.2 billion. I opened a submenu. I initiated a transfer. It wasn't a donation. It wasn't an investment. I typed in the routing number for a private account managed by the warden of the federal penitentiary where Richard was being held. Amount $50,000. Memo for the comfort and security of inmate Richard Brookfield. Ensure he has friends. I hesitated for a second. It was petty. It was vindictive. Eleanor might have frowned upon it. She believed in justice, not cruelty. But I wasn't Eleanor. I was Sharon. And I remembered the way Richard had looked at me when he handed me that box of trash. I remembered the fear in my stomach when his men broke down my door. He was going to prison for 20 years. But prison could be a lonely place, or it could be a terrifying place. I wanted to make sure he had friends, the kind of friends who would remind him, every single day, that he was not in charge, the kind of friends who would make sure he never forgot the name Vance. I hit enter. Transfer complete. I closed the laptop. I sat back in the chair and closed my eyes. I listened to the roar of the ocean. For 32 years, I had been the ghost in the background. I had been the glitch in the system. I had been the girl they forgot to invite, the cousin they forgot to respect, the granddaughter they thought was weak. They were wrong. I wasn't the glitch. I was the patch. I was the code that fixed the system. I opened my eyes. The sun was setting, casting a long, golden line across the water. It was a cold light, sharp and clear. I was alone. But for the first time in my life, I wasn't lonely. I had a legacy. I had the mission. And I had the name. My name is Sharon Vance, and I am just getting started. The screen of my laptop went black. The only sound left was the crashing of the waves against the rocks below, a rhythm that would last forever. Thank you so much for listening to this story. Please let me know in the comments where you are listening from. I would love to hear your thoughts on Sharon's journey and her final decision. Don't forget to subscribe to the Family Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and hit the hype button so more people can hear this story.